Hi, welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Colin Dueck. I'm a senior non-resident fellow. And today we're having a discussion on the topic of, do we still need the United Nations and the World Health Organization? These institutions, founded in the 1940s, have faltered in recent years, and the COVID pandemic has exposed basic flaws in their design. Attitudes toward these organizations span the full range of opinion. Some believe we should abandon them altogether. Others refuse to acknowledge any major flaws with their current form. But what would a sensible conservative approach to reforming and correcting these organizations look like? I'm very happy to be joined by a great group of panelists today. I'll just introduce them very briefly. Richard Goldberg is Senior Advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Brett Schaefer is J. Kingham Senior Research Fellow in International Regulatory Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Danielle Pletka is Distinguished Senior Fellow here at AEI. And John Yu is a non-resident Senior Fellow here at AEI. All four have written widely and intelligently on this topic. What should a conservative approach to international organizations look like? And I've asked our panelists to open with roughly 5 minutes each, addressing one or more of the questions as they like. The questions are, what are some of the most important challenges today regarding leading international organizations such as the WHO and the UN Human Rights Council? How has the Biden administration tackled the challenge of managing these organizations? What, in your view, is the appropriate response for the US to adopt toward these same organizations? Can you offer us a few policy recommendations? And then what are your legal or constitutional concerns, if any, around US participation? So we will start with Richard. Richard, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Big questions in 5 minutes. I'll try to tackle with a broad overview and allow some of my colleagues to fill in some of the blanks after me. The way I think of this as a conservative viewing the international organization space is listing our priorities for how we will approach individual international organizations and perceive whether they are in US interest or not, and then understand what we are going to do about each of them based on that assessment. Number one, we have great power competition stemming from our national security strategy. We've talked now for several years in various domains about great power competition between the United States and China, and also with Russia. The UN space, the international organization space, is yet one of those political battlefields where that great power competition is playing out. With China, we see a multi-pronged strategy that they have within the IO sphere, especially within standards-making organizations. We think of organizations like the International Telecommunications Union, where they were able to get elected to a top leadership post, use that to try to push standards in the telecom, 5G, next generation telecom type standards, the internet, to their advantage, pushing Huawei and other Chinese made standards in telecom and high tech. We've seen that not just in the ITU, but also in the National Standards Organization, ISO. We see that in organizations you wouldn't think of as far as standards, postal standards in the Universal Postal Union, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and so on. And so we have to understand that that is something that China is trying to accomplish, and we need to be very strong in our leadership in organizations where we have the potential for leverage to push back, not allow Chinese leaders to be elected to these organizations, and ensure that US and our allies are in fact in control of those organizations that are setting major international standards. We also see China using some organizations to their advantage to align with their Belt and Road Initiative. We think of the UN Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, Food and Agriculture Organization, and others. This is something that we need to be very watchful of and integrate into our counter BRI strategy as the United States and our allies. China also uses UN organizations to whitewash some of its behavior and to exclude some of US allies like Taiwan to advance their strategic goals. We see that in the Human Rights Council, where they've gotten themselves elected to the council to whitewash crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. We see that at the WHO and other international organizations, where they move to exclude Taiwan from even observer status, let alone membership. And so we have a lot on our plate within the great power competition with China to be involved and great advocates for U.S. leverage and leadership in some of these international organizations where that leadership and leverage is possible. Russia, we also see very involved in trying to advance its interests and undermine U.S. interests, particularly in arms control agencies and organizations related to weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and the like. We need to be very watchful of this in the IAEA, the OPCW, and other type of organizations to push back on Russian disinformation, where they are trying to whitewash their own non-complicity with international agreements and those of their proxies like Syria or Iran. Another piece in our prioritization after great power competition is a principle of standing for defending U.S. economic interests, defending U.S. security interests, and defending U.S. sovereignty. That could play out at the WTO for economic interests. That could also play out in not participating in international organizations where U.S. sovereignty and economic interests could be threatened, like passage and ratification of the Law of the Sea Treaty. What we also have is systemic anti-Semitism throughout the UN system and attacks on our allies. We talked a little bit about Taiwan, but obviously we've talked for many years about the systemic anti-Semitism and anti-Israel treatment across UN agencies. That is something that we have to deal with. The Human Rights Council, for example, where the Biden administration right now is attempting to run for a seat on the council, has voted to create a new commission of inquiry to explore war crimes against the state of Israel and potentially even label Israel an apartheid state. This is something the U.S. cannot be complicit in, especially in an organization that has no way of actually exerting leadership or leverage. And really probably needs to be rethought as far as its existence. We also need to look at other organizations where anti-Semitism rears its head. The WHO, for example. WHO isn't just a place that's covered up the COVID-19 origins and sort of helped China cover up the existence of COVID-19 to begin with. It's not just a place that excludes Taiwan membership. It's not just a place that allows Syria to be elected to its executive council. It also pauses its annual meeting every year to condemn the state of Israel. Something is very broken in the World Health Organization and many other organizations like it. I'll say one other thing. We saw at the Human Rights Council just the other day, Hillel Neuer of UN Watch, one of our colleagues, simply try to expose anti-Semitism from the organization UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, the so-called Palestinian Refugee Agency, was cut off when simply displaying video documenting this anti-Semitism from a UN agency. There is something severely wrong within the UN system when it comes to systemic anti-Semitism and its castigation of Israel. And so that's how I would view the prioritization. China, Russia, state sponsors of terrorism like Iran, Syria, ensuring that we don't allow U.S. finances, U.S. money going to these organizations to end up in the hands of terrorists. This is going to be very important as we look at next steps in Afghanistan, as we've seen what's happened in Syria with aid that's gone through the UN, handled by the Assad regime, and then defending U.S. allies, Taiwan and Israel, and ending the systemic anti-Semitism throughout the UN system.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Let's hear next from Brett. Brett, you're muted.
Yes, I am muted. I muted myself to not interrupt Rich, so I apologize. Thank you, Colin, and thank you to AEI for having me on the panel today. The topic of conservative policy toward international organizations is one that's dear to my heart. I've been working on it for over 2 decades now. Needless to say, I have a lot of thoughts, too many to fit into 5 minutes, but I hope to give a decent overview. The United States was instrumental in establishing the United Nations, and it continues to value the founding principles laid out in the UN Charter, including maintaining international peace and security, encouraging the self-determination of peoples, and promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Unfortunately, these principles are too often ignored or willfully violated by the member states. This has gravely undermined many UN organizations. Let's take a look at 2 different notable examples. First, the Human Rights Council. The Council was created in 2006 after former Secretary General Kofi Annan acknowledged that the declining credibility of the Council's predecessor, the Commission on Human Rights, had, quote, cast a shadow on the reputation of the United Nations system as a whole, unquote. Annan called for the Commission to be replaced, and the Council was the result. Unfortunately, the Council has fallen victim to the same problems that beset the old Commission. Anti-Israel bias. Roughly 40% of the condemnatory resolutions passed by the HRC have focused on Israel. An unwillingness to confront influential states about their human rights violations. The Council has never passed a condemnatory resolution on China, for instance. And human rights abusers regularly getting elected to the Council and impeding its work. Historically, governments that have been deemed not free and partly free by Freedom House have comprised a majority of the membership of the Council. Second, the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization has had a series of missteps over the past decade, not just COVID-19, where the organization's response was terrible, but also Ebola. And just this past few months, we've seen incidents where WHO workers have been accused of sexual exploitation and abuse. But even as COVID-19 was spreading around the world, the WHO continued to parrot Beijing's talking points, even praising the regime repeatedly for its transparency and cooperation when it deserved no praise at all because it was not transparent and was not cooperating. The WHO leadership, particularly Director General Tedros, and the member states refused to confront China over its failure to cooperate with an investigation into the origins of the disease, and kind of supported or placated or entertained the idea that the disease was coming from abroad outside of China when everybody and all the evidence indicates otherwise. Historically, the U.S. response to poorly performing international organizations has swung widely. The past two administrations, the Trump administration and the Biden administration, exemplify these two very different approaches. President Trump's response to flawed international organizations was to call for reforms, but Trump often failed to provide details, leaving allies to wonder what would satisfy the U.S. Trump talked tough and he followed up. Trump was more than willing to use pressure. When the HRC and the WHO were not reformed, for instance, he left both organizations. By applying pressure, Trump did have some success in terms of reform at the Universal Postal Union and at ICAO, which Rich referenced earlier. However, Trump's inconsistency and impatience made achieving his goals harder. In truth, he often undermined his diplomatic efforts and his own negotiators, and his affinity for tough measures sometimes short-circuited potential victories down the road. President Biden, by contrast, seems only to value carrots. Sticks apparently don't exist in the multilateral world, according to Biden. Among Biden's first actions were to restore U.S. funding and reverse Trump's decisions to withdraw from the WHO and the Human Rights Council. The Biden administration deliberately chose not to link re-engagement or restoration of funds to any reforms or advancement of broader U.S. interests. Biden has repeatedly thrown away leverage, hoping that his generosity would be reciprocated by the organizations or by the other member states. Unsurprisingly, that didn't happen. Biden's re-engagement and renewed financial support has garnered statements of appreciation from UN leadership and from other governments, but no tangible progress on reform. Quite frankly, an American administration that shies away from confrontation and pressure and relies solely on diplomacy and engagement is not going to succeed in reshaping international organizations or restoring them to their original purpose. So what should we do? We need to rely both on carrots and sticks, not one or the other, which has been typical. America has too many interests abroad to pull back. It must engage internationally to defend its political, strategic, and economic concerns. As disappointing and frustrating as it often is to work through international organizations, the reality is that it's often the best or the least difficult way for the United States to either get coordinated joint efforts by other governments or to address secondary, tertiary problems that it doesn't want to address directly, but that need attention. The United States, however, cannot be wedded solely to working through multilateral approaches. It must be willing to confront and pressure other organizations or the international organizations and other member states to defend our interests. In the end, international organizations are a tool. They're not an end in themselves. And we should approach our policy toward them like they are a tool. If the tool works, the U.S. should utilize it and support it. If the tool could work but is flawed or damaged, then the U.S. needs to seek to repair it using pressure, diplomacy, or incentives as appropriate. If, however, the tool is broken or unsuited to the task, the U.S. should not be shy about abandoning it or replacing it. Such a decision is not about yielding the field to other nations or choosing to disengage. It's about choosing not to lend U.S. legitimacy and support to a counterproductive or harmful institution. In conclusion, American leadership can be decisive in improving the performance of international organizations and advancing U.S. goals through them. But if the U.S. is going to succeed, it must not hesitate to use the tools available to it, including financial leverage and incentives, diplomatic and economic pressure, or even the threat of withdrawal if the matter is serious enough. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Brett. Danny, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Colin. Now, as everybody who's on with me knows, I have been frantically running around trying to fix my Wi-Fi. So I came in at the end of Rich's presentation. I didn't hear Colin's introduction. John, have you spoken yet? Well, damn it, John. And I did hear everything Brett has to say, so that was perfect. And you know, not surprisingly, we all see these things. We all see these things pretty similarly. It's not really a question of, I think, from my perspective, a question of conservatism or liberalism. Certainly parties have different viewpoints. You know, the Democratic Party, as Brett laid out very clearly, sort of has a check the box, they must be good because they're UN organizations kind of an attitude. Let's fund it. You know, if they don't do a good job, let's ignore it, because after all, we don't really expect them to do a good job either. We're just like the Republicans, only they don't want to fund it. You know, so what I see are real partisan differences. The way I've often phrased this is that these are organizations that, if they didn't exist, we would want to create them, right? If we had been hit by this pandemic, COVID, and let's set aside the question of the provenance and the Chinese and the bat lab and everything else. What would have happened if the world had been struck by a novel coronavirus? Well, of course, we all would have gotten together and said, what we need is an international organization that can facilitate not just in the uptake, but also in the research, but also in the distribution of palliatives, of a vaccine, and a place where we can have consensus. So, you know, all of these things, I think, whether you are a conservative or not, make sense at a certain moment. There is this, you know, knee-jerk and to a large extent, I share this dislike of supranational organizations that are answerable to no one. And that's really where I think a lot of the sort of the jaundiced look that conservatives bring to many of these organizations, because the big question for many of us is not, is it doing a good thing? Is it the right idea to start with? It is, what does the governance look like? Where is the accountability? Where are we getting what we pay for? And especially for the United States taxpayer, the big question, as we are in almost every instance the largest funder of each and every one of these organizations, well beyond the ones we're talking about today, is, are we getting our bang for our buck? And here we come to the problem that we confront all the time, which is that our institutions that are meant to function as oversight don't really do that job. The last time we had a major UN reform effort in the Congress, and that is in the jurisdiction of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the last time we had it was when I was on the Hill, and that was a while ago for those of you who know me. That was, yes, Helms Biden, a man who's forgotten more than he's forgotten about the United Nations. But at that moment, we used the leverage that was available to us on Capitol Hill because we provided these funds, the power of the purse. We sat down and demanded that there be reductions in peacekeeping funding, that there be reductions in other assessments, and that the United Nations, in fact, be more accountable to us. This has all been forgotten in the quarter of a century since it passed. forgotten. We've slid back into larger payments. But there's another problem for us as well. And this is something that Brett alluded to tangentially. It's something that he and I have written about a great deal. And it is something in the case of the World Health Organization, less in the case of the UN Human Rights Council, although even there, which is that we see that governments that have a will to dominate, and in this case, most instances, the People's Republic of China actually have a huge amount of influence in these organizations. And we have, in true supine fashion, sort of laid back and watched as the Chinese have dominated, so that the person who is in fact in charge of the World Health Organization, while he is an Ethiopian national, nonetheless was the Chinese candidate. In other instances of important specialized agencies, we've got actual Chinese. The United States woke up to this a few years ago and started to oppose the Chinese usurpation of UN agencies, but not always to perfect effect, because we don't pay very much attention. I just want to add one last thing, because I really want to have a conversation with all of you, and I also want to hear what John has to say. For those of you who know my colleague, our colleague, Mark Thiessen, Mark and I have a podcast. We hosted Scott Gottlieb, our AEI colleague, former FDA commissioner, on the podcast last week. And one of the things that was most interesting to me in talking about vaccines, which is front and center on all of our minds, was something that Scott said that I believe hasn't gotten a lot of attention. He said, there have been made probably at this point about 15 billion vaccines. We are on the cusp of having billions more. Our problem is not that Americans are greedily trying to hog a third booster vaccine for themselves in their Western arrogance. It is that the World Health Organization is falling down on the very job it was created to perform, which is distribution networks for these vaccines in underprivileged and less developed countries. What we have is tons of vaccine, tons of product, but the World Health Organization isn't delivering it. The stakeholders in the World Health Organization and in the UN Security Council are sitting around twiddling their thumbs, feeling bad about the fact that they got vaccinated when someone else didn't. And this is a microcosm of the larger problem that we face at all times. Thanks a lot for doing this, Colin.
That was great. So you walked on and hit a home run. Let's hear from John now.
Thanks, Colin. If Danny's the cleanup hitter, I'm just a mere pinch hitter that's put in the ninth inning just so I can get in at bat. Thanks. So thanks for having me, Colin. I want to thank AEI for having me. Also, they gave me the chance for the first time, I think, in 30 years to see the sunrise out here at the East Coast. It's really quite beautiful, but I don't want to repeat the experience. I'm too old. But let me start out by saying thanks to AEI, thanks to Colin, thanks to my fellow panelists. As Danny said, I think we all probably agree in our sort of instinctive skepticism of international organizations. I'm going to provide, I think, in just a few minutes, a legal perspective, which is ambivalent about the kinds of organizations or how they're structured, but basically argue that the Constitution and our laws cabin the ways that we can cooperate with other countries or coordinate activities. Just what Danny was just talking about, how do the nations of the world cooperate to deliver vaccines throughout the world? And then some ways the Constitution as the governing document that regulates our sovereignty as a people, that it places some absolute limits on what can be done. And you'll see the Constitution has some severe restrictions on whether sovereignty can be transferred outside the control of the federal government. I wrote a book, I'm glad to say 10 years ago, called Taming Globalization. And I'm happy to say that I wrote about the issue we're talking about today, but 10 years way too early. And the argument in that book was that what we're seeing in international organizations is sort of a rerun of what we fought over in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. Then it was nationalization. Before then, Most of our governmental powers were done locally. We didn't have a lot of federal agencies. We didn't have a lot of sweeping national regulation. But in response to nationalization, we created a government of almost unlimited national power and a powerful bureaucracy to use those powers in ways that diminished transparency and diminished popular involvement. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, whose brainchild this all was, said that we want to give power to experts and take it away from the dirty world of politics. Think about what's taking place today. What we're talking about is essentially the response to globalization. If, as Danny said, the pandemic is sort of a good test case, that's a good example of how the problems which used to be national are now supranational. Constitution, this is just something that happened, just like nationalization did over 100 years ago. As people often say, virus doesn't stop at the borders. And so no single nation can effectively answer these kinds of problems by itself. There has to be some kind of cooperation. As Danny said, whether you're conservative or liberal, you'd want some kind of organization to play the role of the World Health Organization. But notice the response. The response is reflexively, I would call it European in nature, or I call it administrative state in nature, just like the experience we had in the big fight over the New Deal. Here now, what we do is we say we're going to have basically international powers of theoretically unlimited reach, right? The dictates of some of the international organizations, for example, like the UN, bind everyone in the world. And we want to create a bureaucracy that also claims to have a sort of unlimited power, not restricted by nation states, in implementing those powers. So here I'd say the International Criminal Court, to me, is sort of the highest expression of this kind of approach to international governance, right? The International Criminal Court can define the crimes, right? It's defined the crime of aggression. And then it claims that no nation state can stop it in its effort to detain and try people, no matter what the nation state, for example, the United States' own laws and own procedures are. Now, a lot of scholars and policymakers in the United States have argued that the Constitution's restrictions should not apply when we come to the case of cooperating with international organizations. However, I think in the last 30 years, we've seen a kind of revisionism arise, mostly led by conservatives, but not just conservatives, who've tried to oppose this. And so Colin asked at the beginning, what are some of the practical proposals? Well, the Supreme Court gave one in a case called Medellin versus Texas, where the International Court of Justice essentially ordered the United States, and actually bypassed the United States, ordered the state of Texas not to execute a Mexican national for a capital crime. In that case, the Supreme Court, of course, said, we don't take orders from the International Court of Justice. Within the territory of the United States, the Supreme Court is the highest court. So you could say in a similar vein, the Constitution does not recognize any other kind of official authority above the federal government or beyond the states. You could see this in something like the treaty power, another possible limitation on efforts to cooperate in our Constitution, and the way conservatives can reinforce the protections for national sovereignty is to say most international agreements should go through the treaty power. We've lived in this period for about the last 60 years. The JCPOA, which a lot of you have written about, have thought about, is a good example, where presidents and Congresses have tried to avoid the treaty clause because they don't like the fact you need 2/3 of the Senate for ratification by coming up with sole executive agreements, or which is what the JCPOA was, as far as I can tell, because I don't think it even really got congressional approval, or what's used for trade agreements, which are simple statutes. Conservatives can press to say, if you really want the United States to have binding permanent arrangements with international organizations, you've got to go through the treaty power. That is the primary way the United States regulates sovereignty vis-a-vis other countries. You can also say that a lot of international obligations have to be done through Congress in terms of their implementation, rather than just allowing the president or the courts that claim they can do it alone. One doctrine that we have in the law is called non-self-execution, where, for example, even if a treaty like the ICC tried to create a crime, even if a treaty like the Law of the Sea Treaty tried to dispose of property, Our constitutional law has said that only Congress can define crimes. Only Congress can tax and spend. Only Congress can pass laws for the regulation of American territory. And so conservatives can say we want to see a reinvigoration of this non-self-execution doctrine. And then the last thing I'll throw out, which is a more radical proposal, is that we should allow states to have a bigger role in how we interact with international organizations. States have the primary regulatory authority for most things in life. Take, again, Danny talked about the pandemic. It's a great test case. Donald Trump didn't shut down all the businesses in the country, and he couldn't reopen all the businesses in the country. That was up to the governors, right? It was Governor Cuomo and Governor Newsom who decided what businesses were open or closed. In fact, they probably have more power over the economy during the shutdown than the President Trump did. We actually could see a world where we press for states to decide whether to adopt or reject international standards just as much as the federal government. And so, again, this approach is ambivalent as to the type of organization, but it does say that the purpose of international organizations, the way they can be accommodated in our constitutional system, is to limit them mostly to information sharing for coordination between sovereign nation states of their activities, but that our Constitution does not really allow for the transfer of governmental sovereignty to international organizations. So thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation, learning more about what the international organizations are really up to in the world stage.
Terrific. Thanks, John. So I'm going to start with a few questions, and then we'll shift to audience questions. So please send them in if you're watching. If you have any questions for our panelists. Several of you touched on this theme that I think is on everyone's mind, and so I'll ask this question and see who wants to tackle it in what order you like. Where exactly do things stand right now in terms of the Biden administration's management of the WHO? There is this striking trend that they didn't ask for much, if anything, and China's never really been held accountable. Where do you think things stand in terms of Biden's approach to the WHO in relation to the pandemic, and where ought we to be looking for improvements? What should we be asking? And I'll let each of you tackle this if you like in the order you prefer.
I nominate Brett.
Brett.
Okay, well,
I nominate Steve Rademacher.
That's right.
Just appeared with coffee with my cappuccino. Where's my cappuccino?
Yep, instead of a cat, it's Steve going through the back. I know that Rich has written on this as well. What was startling to me in terms of the Biden administration's approach to the WHO wasn't that they decided to re-engage or reverse Trump's decision to withdraw from the organization, is that they did it without putting any kind of conditions on it whatsoever. The U.S. was in a huge position of leverage. The United States is the largest funder of the WHO. It has the level of expertise and the level of cooperation between the U.S. CDC and the World Health Organization is critical. The United States is the most influential member of this organization, not only in terms of the pandemic response, and not just in terms of funding, but in terms of other diseases like Ebola, like other activities of the World Health Organization in terms of mental health and other things as well. The United States is intimately involved in cooperating with the WHO. And so that prospect of the US re-engaging with the World Health Organization should have been an enormous temptation for the other member states and for the bureaucracy there to try and meet US demands, especially since our demands were not unreasonable. They're talking about how to prevent the next pandemic, how to respond more effectively to the next pandemic. What are the flaws in the international health regulations that allowed us to misread this current situation so badly that resulted in millions of lives and trillions of dollars in economic lost productivity? These are not unreasonable demands. And the Biden administration, instead of going to the organization saying, hey, these are the things that we would like to do, and we would like to see them done before the U.S. re-engages fully, they didn't do that. And so now we spent basically the past 9 months doing nothing in terms of UN WHO reform. And it's a huge lost opportunity. It's allowed China to obfuscate on this investigation to the origins of COVID-19. And frankly, it's allowed the discussion about the future of the WHO and how to reform the organization going forward to devolve into the normal disputes between member states that happen every year in every World Health Assembly going back in time. So we had an opportunity to really capitalize and really move the ball forward, and the Biden administration fumbled it by not taking advantage of it.
I would go even further than Brett. So he and I, in working on this joint AEI heritage project on the United Nations, started our work on the WHO during the Trump administration. In fact, not just during the Trump administration, but before Donald Trump pulled the United States out of the WHO. And what we saw was that the people on the working level had actually gone to our allies who share these concerns. It's not like the Brits and the Australians and the French look at the WHO and think to themselves, oh, we can't see what you're talking about. This seems great. They share these concerns, whether they're structural or they're on delivery or they're on the specific pandemic response. And so they had actually put together a menu of reforms. There was a consensus on the need for those reforms. And Donald Trump pulled the rug out from under them, as was his wont so often with his staff. The issue here is that all of that knowledge, all of that diplomatic work, and it was diplomatic work with our allies, was just thrown by the wayside when it was offered up to the Biden folks as a means of trying to get something for going back in, as Brett described. There was a complete and total indifference, partly because of the sort of Trump derangement syndrome, but partly because it's always cost-free.
I'll add just.
Rich, are you going to talk about Tedros and the election?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Go ahead.
Sorry to steal the thunder, but no, I think Brett, you talked about the lost leverage, and Danny, you piled on of the decision to go back in participation, restart our funding, our contribution, without having achieved any reforms whatsoever, without achieving an independent investigation into COVID-19 origins, something like an oil for food investigation only for COVID-19 is really what we need, not something that's led by the organization that failed in the first place, and obviously is subject to undue influence from Beijing. Regulation reform, accountability of the WHR, a narrowing of the mandate, allowing Taiwan to have at least observer membership at the WHO. Taiwan, by the way, leading efforts in COVID-19 response, not even allowed to coordinate on COVID-19 response as an even observer to the World Health Assembly. That is insane and only serves Beijing's interests. Doing away with the annual agenda item at the WHO that has to do with Israel, which makes absolutely no sense to pause in the middle of a pandemic to condemn the state of Israel. There's only one reason to do that. And also to take up the issue of Syria having been elected to the Executive Council. Absolutely insane regime that has gassed its own people. We have, under the Trump administration, we waged an intense diplomatic fight to suspend Syria's voting rights at the OPCW due to their non-compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention. The same should be done at the WHO. None of that happened, and absolutely agree with the fact that we lost our leverage by just handing the money back over and saying, here we are. But even if you buy into the Biden administration's thesis that engagement is what is needed, and that's really the core sometimes of the differences, as we were alluding to, that all you need to do is be there in the room where it happens, and suddenly everything's going to be fine as long as we are just there, going to the cocktail parties and handing the money over. The other source of leverage we had, Danny talked about this earlier, governance. If we have an ability to influence the governance and governing and the leadership of an organization that we are the primary funder of, then we need to take that responsibility on to improve that organization and to control its direction. Dr. Tedros is not just a failure as a leader of an organization. He is somebody who has clearly shown undue influence to Beijing in the middle of a pandemic. If this was any organization, a nonprofit, a corporation, and the CEO had performed as Dr. Tedros had in a failure, a catastrophic international failure of like the likes of COVID-19, that CEO would be fired by the board immediately. He would not be able to run and seek a second term as the Director General. And we faced, as the United States, a September 15th deadline under the WHO rules to nominate somebody to run against Dr. Tedros, who is running for re-election. And this administration did not field a candidate, did not even work with a partner in the international system to field a candidate that they would back and nominate. Nothing. It is so insane to think about, but Dr. Tedros, after leading the WHO through this COVID-19 pandemic and all of its failures from the beginning to today, is going to walk to re-election as Director General. We have completely abdicated our responsibility in response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Let me throw in just something a little more abstract, but maybe it helps. I think there's I was looking recently at a history of the UN and its establishment, and think about how FDR wanted the Security Council to work. He didn't really think the Security Council was some independent institution that would come up with decisions and then nations would follow them, which is kind of how we're thinking of, right, the WHO and so on. He thought that the great powers would get together, right, negotiate amongst themselves first, come to a decision, and then act through the Security Council. And I think that's what we should, the Biden administration, if it wants to forestall another pandemic, really ought to do. If we're going to think of the pandemic as the test case, as Richard just said, the WHO was a failure. It even failed at the information sharing, the thing that it should be better, put aside whether it can actually mandate things and command things, but just creating a forum where the nations of the world could get an early warning system created for the emergence of these kinds of potential pandemics and take swift action to help China or to help other countries where these things break out. And so I would say the Biden administration, I assume politically, let's talk about the future. They have failed in these ways so far, but how would you tell the Biden administration what you should do going forward? Well, obviously they're going to be focused on not allowing another pandemic to occur. How are we really going to do it? The real bargaining problem here is that the wealthy nations of the world with good healthcare systems, right? They have the resources to try to prevent these. They want to protect their own populations. The United States needs to know early when the things break out. Countries where these have historically broken out, which tends to be China and nations around China, they have an interest in concealing information about when these things break out. I think the Biden administration should be pressured not to act through the WHO at all, but to work out a deal directly with China, along with our NATO and democratic allies, to force China to try to produce information early, to give it, some of you mentioned earlier, carrots and sticks to encourage it to change its behavior, because that's the only way that we can really solve this pandemic problem. And that's, I think, in the political interests of the Biden administration. It means that the WHO itself is not as important. It's more, it could be just the formal organ through which we essentially inform everyone else of the deal that the great powers have already worked out. And in this case, with the pandemic, it means the United States has to take more aggressive sanctions, punishing China, but also hold out in the future the promise of greater rewards if it helps build this early warning system that we need in China to detect future pandemics.
Great, thank you all. And Brett, I wanted to make sure, did you have another thought?
Oh, no.
No? Okay.
I was just going to talk about the re-election of Tedros, and Rich covered that.
Okay, great, thank you. So another question I had for all of you, again, in the same format, and we've touched on this a little bit, but I'm just struck how many of these agencies, international institutions have this really just bizarre fixation on Israel, way out of proportion to any relationship to reality. Can you explain to us, where does this come from? What are some of the challenges for the U.S. specifically? How can we counteract it? And what should members of Congress do? What can they do, if anything, in relation to the Biden administration and that challenge?
Well, I'm happy to jump in first, and others please follow. Historically, we have a marriage of convenience between Arab powers going back to the creation of the State of Israel that were at war with the nascent Jewish state and developed political warfare lines of effort along in parallel with their military lines of effort to destroy the Jewish state. And that took place inside the United Nations and in UN fora that were created. All these different bodies established for the Palestinians to serve as institutional castigation points against the state of Israel, to push back on the state of Israel, to give up territory, to have to fall back to insecure borders that could then obviously fulfill the military vision of retaking all the land that had been established as the Jewish state in 1948. That occurred alongside the backdrop of the Cold War and the Soviet Union lining up, seeing Israel as a threat, as an ally of the United States. And a lot of the sort of rhetoric we hear today that has been reborn within some of the very far left fringes of the Democratic Party and on the international stage are actually resuscitation of a lot of the lines of attack, the propaganda that the Soviets used against Israel, Zionism as racism and the like from decades ago, now being given a new platform by the far radical left. What we have seen is not just these Palestinian organizations, but those who are detractors of Israel go into as many agencies as they can and find ways to continue to weaponize the agendas of the organization, the rules against the state of Israel. And so in organizations like the WHO, for example, where you would not expect there to be the politics of the Middle East playing out in an organization that's core mission is simply to deal with something like we are dealing with today, information sharing, distribution networks that has been discussed. The idea that you would stop there and have an agenda item simply to criticize the state of Israel is the politicization, is the weaponization of these agencies against the state of Israel. And we've seen this in other cases, in UNESCO, for example, where it's not just been castigation of the state of Israel, it's been really a protracted effort to try to delegitimize the Jewish people's historic rights and legacy in the land of Israel, to sort of do away with Jewish sites, preservation, do away with the idea that Jerusalem, for example, is a holy city for Jews. So a lot of these fights have been playing out for many years. The Human Rights Council, obviously, one of the most vicious platforms for this. I mentioned at the top this commission of inquiry that's been established. Very, very dangerous. We saw this one before with the Goldstone report. Many will remember the Goldstone Commission. This is sort of a Goldstone 2.0 on steroids. No end to its mandate, can go on forever. And the scope appears like a setup to try to indict Israel as an apartheid state, something that comes out of the very far radical left language today, and perhaps even try to refer them to the International Criminal Court. So this is going to be a major test for the Biden administration. They claim that they had to go back into the Human Rights Council because that's the only way to fix the Human Rights Council, even though we know from its governance structure it is truly unfixable. They say they're going to run for a seat on the council, be back at the table in 2022. We'll see. Are they going to be able to stop this commission of inquiry? Can they suspend it? Can they get rid of it? Are they going to be complicit and be at the table as the Human Rights Council indicts Israel for crimes against humanity or apartheid? That will be a real test for this administration. Two other things I'll note. One we talked about earlier, UNRWA, the UN UN Relief and Works Agency. This is really something that Congress has taken a look at for a long time. Not only is it a threat to U.S. funds going to terrorist organizations like Hamas in Gaza, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and others, it's also really the institutional political warfare against the state of Israel, keeping alive this idea of a right of return, that millions of people are somehow refugees from a war that took place decades ago, waiting to return to their rightful places inside modern-day Israel. It foments anti-Semitism, as our colleague Helen Neuer tried to show to the Human Rights Council, but was cut off and told it was offensive to UNRWA to demonstrate anti-Semitism at the organization. Its textbooks raise Palestinians to hate Jews and hate Israel. A very broken organization indeed. One light of hope, I would say, the Abraham Accords. This is the opportunity perhaps to try to finally shift the narrative. If there are opportunities we can seize upon, and I will say it will take U.S. leadership, which at this point is lacking, to try to drive an agenda. Could there be a way to bring Gulf nations that have normalized relations with Israel together with the United States inside some of these fora to push back, get rid of agenda items, stop some of these votes, and actually work on programs of work that promote integration in the region? That would be a great day. I'm pretty hesitant it's going to happen. Our Secretary General, in his last UN General Assembly address right after the Abraham Accords, didn't even mention the Abraham Accords. Sort of like the raison d'etre of the UN to promote peace and security in the world. And historic Middle East peace happens, and the UN Secretary General doesn't even note it in his annual address to the UN. We got some problems at Turtle Bay.
Colin, I think Rich went over very well the issue in that sort of permeates the UN system as a whole. There are a couple of things, and I think he's right that if there's going to be a change inside the organization, it starts by breaking apart the Middle Eastern consensus, Arab country consensus, toward Israel through negotiations like the Abraham Accords, where diplomatic ties and relations between Israel are enhanced and developed, and so that knee-jerk consensus is not so knee-jerk. I think that's the way to go forward. But there are a couple of other things that I wanted to add to this. One is the Palestinians have for years tried to sort of delegitimize Israel and undermine the peace process with Israel by getting recognition through the UN system. Rich mentioned UNESCO. The Palestinians actually got full membership in UNESCO. Under US law, this prevented the United States from providing any assessed or voluntary funding to the organization. This happened under the Obama administration, but the Obama administration tried to change the law to keep funding going to UNESCO rather than try to pressure the organization not to accept UNESCO in the first place. This resulted in over $500 million in arrears before Donald Trump actually decided to pull the United States out of UNESCO to sort of stop this financial hemorrhaging. But there's still members in the Democratic coalition that want to change the law, pay $500 million to UNESCO to fund God knows what, because the organization will be able to use that money however it wants to, and sort of reward and encourage the Palestinians to do this to other UN organizations as well. That's something that we can't let happen if we do have the interests of our ally Israel in mind. In terms of the Human Rights Council, this is another example of the Biden administration throwing away leverage. The Biden administration decided to re-engage with the Human Rights Council, run for a seat on the Human Rights Council, even though Secretary of State Blinken acknowledged the fact that anti-Israel bias is embedded in the organization, is a fundamental flaw of the organization. He said that they want to get rid of Agenda Item 7, which is the part of the HRC agenda that focused solely on Israel. And he says that these are things they want to do. But right now, the Human Rights Council is up for mandatory review. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution saying the Human Rights Council needs to be reviewed between 2021 and 2025. Where's the Biden administration's reform agenda? Where is their effort to engage other member states to try and change these fundamental flaws that Secretary Blinken acknowledged? Instead, you're giving tacit U.S. Legitimacy to an organization that you say is fundamentally flawed. And that is not a way to go about achieving reform or working with other member states to try and convince them that reform is necessary.
I do think it's very important when we talk about this. Obviously, we're all like-minded about this, and that in some ways doesn't represent what the average conversation is that happens in Washington around these organizations. I think the challenge for us is to remember that the counter argument is always, but these organizations do so much good, right? So, yeah, of course, they don't, they hate Israel, but let's set that aside. Yeah, the International Criminal Court is overly focused on this, but, on the other hand, they're the only organization focused on bringing dictators to justice in Africa, et cetera. And so, I think that this is a challenge for us is to actually make an articulate argument about why, in fact, these negative traits are systemic, that in fact you can't support an organization that, he's a wife beater, but he's a really good earner. This is kind of our argument that we like to make. And I think it's important to underscore that that's the counter argument we hear. It's not that people say, oh, they really don't, they really don't do these bad things. It's that they say the other good things they do are so important. This is especially the case, as Rich knows, on UNRWA. Sure, they're problematic, but they're trying to improve. And, there wouldn't be anybody else if it weren't for them. And the answer is, then maybe there should just be somebody else.
Very good. Thank you all. We have an interesting question from the audience here. I'll read it out, and it's on the law of the sea. So again, the same format, whoever would like to take a crack at this. The Navy, the questioner says, has consistently supported the ratification of the law of the sea. U.S. ratification would arguably benefit U.S. defense interests. For example, it would strengthen U.S. efforts to counter China's. Should the U.S. ratify the law of the sea?
I could go first, I guess. There's two parts to the law of the sea, one that the Navy likes, and then the one I think which has sovereignty problems. The part that the Navy likes and that the United States likes is the rules on freedom of navigation, what we consider the customary laws of freedom of the seas that go back to the time of Grotius. Grotius wrote the first book in the 17th century, right, about the freedom of the law of the seas. The parts of the treaty that cause problems, and certainly the United States could say, we commit, as I think the United States has said, we commit to following and considering those rules about the freedom of the law of the seas to be this sort of customary international law, which we will obey. The problem with the law of the sea treaty is not the freedom of navigation rules, it's the management of the undersea resources, under the seabed resources. And there you see the problems that I think I was describing about what international organizations are evolving into, which is not a forum for independent nation states that are sovereign to work out their disputes, to cooperate and coordinate their activity, but instead a claim to create a new kind of government, right, that has global authority to implement rules against which nations are not allowed to invoke their sovereignty. And so recall that the Law of the Sea Treaty basically claims authority to, right, give out permits, to give out mining rights to the seabed, and then to tax part of it, right? So if again, these are resources that are not within the territorial sovereignty of any nation. Traditionally in the past, anybody was allowed to develop the resources of the high seas. And then this authority claims the right to tax it and then to redistribute it to nations, to poor nations, essentially, subject to some formula that is up to this authority. It's not really up to the nation states. That, I think, is the problem, is this effort to create for the United States, and I think should be still the stumbling block to ratification, is creating this global supranational authority which claims authority over nation states and then even seeks to exercise taxing and spending authority outside the control of the United States government.
Colin, I have two quick thoughts on this. One is I'm not an expert on the law of the sea treaties, fully admit that. My colleague Steve Groves has written and studied quite a bit about it. And he's noted that the freedom of navigation provisions are present in other pre-existing international agreements. So it's not as if the law of the sea is codifying something new. It's essentially just repeating what already exists under international law and customary international law. In terms of the broader argument, which is how the law of the sea might help the United States counter China in the South China Sea, well, China's ratified the law of the sea treaty, and they were brought up by the Philippines for breaches of the treaty to the arbitral tribunal, and China was found to be in violation of the treaty. And guess what China did? It ignored it. There's been no ramifications for China. There's been no actions. There's been a lot of angry words. There's been a lot of countries that are extraordinarily upset about it, but it has not changed China's behavior in any way. And I think anybody that thinks that the United States ratification of the law of the sea treaty is going to change China's observance of it is living in a fantasy.
And I would just say, not only living in disobedience and non-compliance with the treaty, but then running on the country regional slate to get a seat on the tribunal itself is the height of just, hypocrisy, just the double standards that exist inside some of these international bodies and treaties. We've seen the United States be a party to many treaties. Arms control comes to mind vis-a-vis bilateral treaties with Russia, where we were held to a different standard than the Russians were. And there's an outcry if we decide, okay, well, one side is not complying with this treaty, why are we binding ourselves to it? And President Trump withdrew the United States from several of these treaties. We have to be clear-eyed. We shouldn't just walk into something where we're going to be held to a double standard, put U.S. sovereignty at risk, as John pointed out, put U.S. economic interests at risk, and still not, be able to hold China to account. In fact, allow China to manipulate the system that has been established.
Thank you all. Another audience question, and this sort of goes to Danny's point about, but these organizations do so much good. The question is, what would the